All right, let's talk about the latest release. I did not get a release out last week. Don't even recall what I got busy with right now, but I got busy with something, a few things. But we got a release out this week, and I'll tell you what is going on. I'm going to skip the first thing, the ArcShell stats file, and come back to that because that is really where the bulk of my work has been the last 2 weeks. Although I have to admit, I haven't had a lot of time to work on it, and it takes a long time to test this because you got to let it run for a few days. And the effort to set up testing that would run a lot faster, something I'd do if I had an employee. I would build a mock for this so that we could generate stats with the right timestamps and all that really fast, and do some validation and things like that. So this eventually is going to need that if I want to be able to make changes to it, enhance it, and then test those changes, because it just takes too long to test statistics if you're actually gathering real statistics over time. So anyway, and it uses awk scripts, and I really haven't thought much about how to write unit tests for awk scripts. Interesting problem. Let's move on. So now with the ArcShell rsync.shell, you can use rsync-dir to sync to local directories. So you can. It normally takes an SSH alias or a connection, and it will do an rsync across SSH. And the reason I use a command like this is, one, I don't have to remember all the little switches. Also, I want, when I use rsync, I want to say I want this directory created or to look like this directory on this other server. So I want my two directories to kind of inform me exactly what's going to happen, not necessarily have to remember that whether it's going to create a directory or whether it's going to create a directory in a directory and things like that. I'll have to work through some examples to make you to fully explain that to you. But now you can't use this command locally. I had some need to use it locally, and I said, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and support that. So you can use this rsync, and it will use your local rsync. It will not go over SSH, and it will sync two directories locally. And that can be very useful for a variety of reasons: backups, syncing to Dropbox, a Dropbox folder once a day, and changing the name of the folder, what have you. Obviously, you can use tar.gz and all these other things, but there was a need for that. And I could go search the code and find out what the need was. With the messaging now, basically, it always assumed queuing it would always use queuing. And so if you hadn't used any of the queuing features of messages, it would still queue it for up to 60 seconds until the service daemon came along and sent the message. I wanted to bypass that entirely because when I want to test sending of messages, I don't want to necessarily have to use the -now, which sends a message immediately, but that explicitly bypasses queuing when you're using send message. I wanted to be able to have you be able to send messages without having the service daemon running. So if you have other code running from cron and it triggers a message, and the service daemon is not running, we want that message still to go out. So now that will happen. If queuing is not enabled, it immediately calls mailx or mail or SendGrid. Those are the programs that are supported right now. If you need something else supported, let me know, and we can get that going. ArcShell DT fixed a bug in DT is weekday. That wasn't returning true for the correct, whether it was a weekday or not. That's just a simple function. It returns true or false if it is a weekday. And on contact groups, simplified the test function to test sending a message. Once you set up your contact groups, you should go ahead and call this function with the group name, just to make sure that the email addresses you set up or SMS text email addresses you set up work, and you actually get a message. ArcShell config had some goofy log terminal calls in there that should have been simple echoes. And there's 3 awk scripts that deal with stats. The first one is when you collect stats, you pipe your metric pipe value, and I mean the pipe character, not actually piping anything. That's the separator, into stats read. It calls it calls an awk file to actually write out the first file, And then at the end of every hour, or when the hour rolls over, you have some hourly calculations that take place that aggregate your detail into an hourly file. It doesn't do anything with your detail, that's still there, but creates a new file with your hourly averages. And then it also uses that hourly data to generate an average history by type of day. That would be a weekday or weekend, just an overall average, and then an average by type of day and hour of day. So over time, you can say, I know that on weekdays at 2 o'clock, this particular metric runs within these ranges. I'm going to show you some of that in a minute. That's the big thing I wanted to talk about, because that's really the really cool feature that I've been meaning to put in forever. This is a lot easier to do in a database with a procedural language, or to do even in Python or something like that. It's a little harder to do in awk and with text files, but it can be done. I have done it, and as far as I know, I'm the first person that's ever done anything like this, and it's very valuable. So that's what the stats work is happening there, and I'm going to jump over to my Twitter feed here. So if you're not following me on Twitter and you kind of want more day-to-day updates and see what's going on, I'm at poststop. So, here is an example. Let's open that up. We can get that open. Okay, so this is the average lookup file. This is being generated once an hour. Eventually, it's going to be generated like once a day. It'll be a batch thing that only needs to be generated once a day. Or if the file is older than, then go ahead and regenerate it. So this is just a data file using pipes for delimiters. And so we've got server load, and in this particular average, it's 1, which means weekday. I believe it's week, or is that weekend? I think that's weekday. That's weekday. 1 is weekday. It means 8 a.m. And what we have is our average. The average for the hour so far as we know, is 1.58. And now it splits into the percentage of that hour. So for 68% of the hour, which is 40 minutes or something like that, it was between 11 and 100%. So we have these generic buckets that I've come up with. I think this will, from my experience, this is going to be enough information to tell you what's going on and if you have a problem without needing it visualized. Now the goal is to visualize all this kind of data, but better than that is, when you're on the road and something goes on, we're going to get a nice report with some visualization perhaps, but you're not going to necessarily need it. A quick glance at some of this kind of information and what's going on presently is all you're going to need to know what is out of whack and for how long and things like that. So what we have here is this bucket, so less than 10%, because we probably want to know if it's 0 or close to 0. It ran between 11 and 100% of the time, 68% of the time, if that makes sense. It ran up to 120%. So now we're kind of dealing with a normal range of activity, what we'd say should be fairly normal. If things run a little over average, that's normal. 24% of the time. And then, this would be our outlier. So 8% of the time, it was above 120%, somewhere between 120 and 100 and 200%. So it's just giving us a range. And there's another file that has a score in it. And I think, let me see. Yeah, here it is. Now, I don't know if this picture is current, but it's giving a score based on these numbers. It has a max score within that that it saw within the that it's achieved within the hour. I'll have to go back and look at this. And then it has an ending score. But this score is relative, right? It's just going to be something over time, you kind of understand, okay, if the scores are above this, I'm probably in a state of having a problem. And then what you can do is just alert off the score generically, any score, or just get notified. And then you could set hard thresholds or soft thresholds for specific metrics based on score if you want. You could look at these buckets, but it's going to be easier just to drive your alerting or your notifications or trigger scripts and things like that using the score. And there'll be an API that's available for you that's very easy to use, that you can set this stuff up really, really fast. And that's our goal. This all runs on the server. It's all local. It's all bash. and there's no external tools needed. You get all of this, built into ArcShell. So you think about it, any metric you want to collect, you automatically can set up. You can start collecting that metric and then have automatic alerting set up on that. So, and a soft threshold, if that doesn't make sense, if you haven't heard that term, I don't know if I made it up or someone else has told me that. But a hard threshold is alert once the value is over this. A soft threshold says, if the ending score is, or if score is over this for this long, then alert. So, kind of a different look there. Okay, so I think that's everything for this release, and I'm going to continue to work on a few other things and probably focus on documentation and next week and try to get some more documentation out. If you're interested in doing a screencast or you'd like more info, we could probably set something up. If you have questions, let me know. I'll be happy to try to answer them or shoot a screencast to answer your question. All right, thanks.